Hi, I'm Janjan, and in this video I'm going to show you how I made this coffee table, which originally started out as a design inspired by Japanese architecture, but it ended up kind of mid-century modern. Let me show you how I made it. I started out with these two slabs of spalted beech, and at this point I didn't really know what the grain looked like. But I got to work marking them up and breaking them down to rough size using a circular saw and a bandsaw, labelling them as I went. Then I sent them through the planer and the thicknesser just to get them to final thickness, and through the table saw to get them to final width. I decided to start with the leg assemblies because they were the most complicated part of the build. So I cut the blanks down to final size, and I'm going to get 2 legs out of each blank. I marked out 1 leg and then used that to make a jig to run through the table saw. This makes sure that all 4 legs are exactly identical. Then I put a toggle clamp on it just to make sure my hands were a safe distance from the blade when I was actually cutting the pieces. With 1 leg cut, I could flip over the remaining piece, clamp that in, and then cut the second leg out of the same piece. Getting the toggle clamp scarily close to that blade. But it was clear, so it's fine. I've made a mistake, but I've caught it in time, so I should be able to fix it. The problem is, on the legs we've got 2 angles. We've got the taper, and then we've got the lean, so the angle of it relative to the tabletop. Now when I designed this, I modelled a 13-degree angle relative to the inside of the leg, but I've cut it relative to the outside of the leg, so it's going to look completely wrong. So what I've done is I've marked up the 13-degree from the right place to see what it looks like, to see how much we're going to lose if I cut that, and it's not very much. So I'm going to carry on with that, cutting the new angle to get it correct back to the design, and the table's just going to be a smidge shorter than it was meant to be. So I'm going to fix that and crack on. With that sorted, I marked up the half lap joint, set the blade height to the thickness of the long stretcher, and then nibbled away the waste with the table saw. With one side done, I could mirror the angle on the mitre gauge, move the fence over to the other side of the saw, and then cut the remaining joints. Then I was ready to glue up the first couple of sub-assemblies. One leg goes right at the end of the long stretcher. Then I used an MDF template to place the second leg at the perfect position. Once the glue had dried, I cut away the excess wood and sanded it all flush. Then I made some slightly sketchy looking setups at the router table to cut the mortises for attaching the short stretchers. I promise it felt better than it looks here. Then I cut some extra wide mortises for the buttons that are going to be used to attach the tabletop. These are extra wide just to allow for seasonal movement of the wood. With those side assemblies done, I cut the short stretches with an angle to match the legs. Then I drilled a couple of holes for the screws that I'm going to use to attach the bottom shelf. And then cut matching mortises for the floating tenons that I'm going to use to attach the whole thing together. Then it was ready for a dry assembly of the frame. Everything looked good, so I took it apart to give it a final sanding before it was all glued up. And then I glued it up. It's always slightly nerve-wracking, but this went really well. Then I turned my attention to the top and the shelf. And while I planed it up, it really became apparent how good this wood looks. Once I got all the pieces cut to size, I glued up both the top and the shelf as 2 board panels. This allowed me to play around with the positioning and get the best look in the grain. Once the glue had dried, I stuck on a piece of plywood to act as a pivot for a makeshift radius jig for the router. This was to round off the ends and give it a bit more of a refined look. I routed down till there was just a paper thin layer of wood left and then used a knife to cut that. Then I used the router to give it a 45-degree chamfer on the ends. Unfortunately, my router bit wasn't anywhere near big enough, so I had to go to final depths with that, but then blend in the rest with a hand plane. Thankfully, the long edges of the top were much easier because I could just stick it straight on the table saw. Then it was ready for final sanding up to 220 grit, cleaning off all the dust, and then applying finish. I went with 4 or 5 coats of Danish oil for this, just to get the perfect luster on the top. Once the finish had cured, I could screw on the shelf, and then position the top perfectly centered, place in the buttons, and have to take the shelf off because I'm an idiot and I couldn't get the drill in there. After that minor mistake, it was plain sailing. And I am really happy with how this came out. The finish on the top looks fantastic, and the grain, I was blown away by it. I really wasn't expecting that when I first got this wood in. I hope you enjoyed watching this build. Subscribe if you want to see more like this, and thanks for watching.